They thought they were crazy for buying a crumbling mansion in the middle of nowhere. But when Harold and Margaret found what was hidden beneath their basement floor, the 70-year-old couple discovered they weren't just homeowners. They were sitting on $220 million in cash, gold, and priceless artifacts that would change their lives forever. Before we explore this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning Harold Brennan received the letter that would change everything, frost still clung to the windows of their cramped Phoenix apartment. At 73, his hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope from the pension board, though whether from age or dread, he couldn't say. Margaret sat across from him at their tiny kitchen table, her silver hair catching the weak winter light. Worry lines etched deep around eyes that had once sparkled with the joy of teaching second graders. The letter was brief and devastating. Effective immediately, Harold's teacher's retirement benefits would be reduced by 30% due to budget shortfalls. Margaret's pension had already been cut the year before. Between them, they now had less than $1,800 a month to live on. Harold set the letter down carefully, his wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the harsh reality of numbers that didn't add up. Rent on their one-bedroom apartment was $1,200 a month. Utilities, food, medication for Margaret's diabetes. The math was simple and unforgiving. How much? Margaret asked, though her voice suggested she already knew. Enough that we can't stay here, Harold said quietly. They'd been married 47 years. She'd taught alongside him at Roosevelt Elementary for 3 decades. They'd dedicated their lives to shaping young minds, believing that public service mattered, that pensions and promises would carry them through their golden years. They'd been wrong. Margaret reached across the table and took his spotted hand in hers. We'll figure something out. We always do. But Harold could see the fear behind her brave smile. At their age, there were no second careers, no windfalls waiting. Their daughter Sarah lived in California with her investment banker husband, and had made it clear that her parents' financial struggles were an embarrassment she didn't want to acknowledge. Their son Michael had died in Iraq 15 years ago, taking with him their dreams of grandchildren who might care for them in their twilight years. They were alone, broke, and running out of options. That evening, Harold sat in the apartment complex's lobby, using the community computer to search for affordable housing. Most of what he found was either unsafe, inaccessible for Margaret's mobility issues, or still beyond their reduced means. He was about to give up when a small listing caught his eye. Estate sale, desert mansion, Mirage, Springs AZ, serious inquiries, only $35,000 or best offer. The listing had no photos, just an address and a phone number. Harold had never heard of Mirage Springs, but something about the price made him pause. A mansion for $35,000? There had to be a catch. He called the number from the payphone in the lobby, feeding quarters into the slot with fingers that trembled slightly. Hartwell Real Estate, this is Janet. I'm calling about the mansion in Mirage Springs, Harold said, a pause. You sure you want to know about that place? Why wouldn't I? Another pause, longer this time. Mister, I've been trying to move that property for 8 years. It's been sitting empty for over 20. The previous owner died under mysterious circumstances. The town's nearly a ghost town, and frankly, most folks think the place is cursed. Harold felt his heart sink. Of course, there was a catch. But, Janet continued, if you're serious about looking, I can show it to you this weekend. Just understand what you're getting into. Mirage Springs is in the middle of nowhere. No decent stores, one diner, and most of the neighbors are rattlesnakes. Harold found himself saying yes before his logical mind could object. He had $300 in his checking account and a desperate need for hope, even foolish hope. That Friday, Harold and Margaret loaded their Honda Civic with everything they owned and drove 2 hours southeast into the Sonoran Desert. The landscape grew increasingly desolate as they left Phoenix behind endless stretches of sand, saguaro cactus, and mountains that looked like sleeping giants against the endless blue sky. Are we really doing this? Margaret asked, as they passed a sign announcing Mirage Springs, population 812. "We're looking," Harold corrected. "That's different than doing." But even as he said it, he felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in months. Possibility. Mirage Springs had clearly seen better days. The main street was lined with empty storefronts, their windows papered over or boarded up. A few elderly residents sat on benches outside the post office, watching their Honda with expressions of mild curiosity. The place felt like a movie set for a Western that had wrapped filming decades ago and never bothered to strike the stage. Janet Hartwell met them at the town's only gas station, a weathered woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense handshake. She looked at Harold and Margaret with something approaching sympathy. "You folks sure you want to see this place?" she asked. "I've got a nice double-wide about 10 miles out that might be more practical." "We're here," Margaret said firmly. "Might as well look." The drive to the mansion took them through neighborhoods of abandoned houses, each one a monument to dreams deferred or destroyed. But as they climbed into the foothills, the properties grew larger, the architecture more ambitious. This had once been where wealthy retirees and Hollywood stars had built desert retreats. Then they saw it. The mansion rose from the desert floor like a mirage made real, its Spanish colonial architecture gleaming white against the red rock landscape. 8,000 square feet of hand-laid stone, clay tile roofing, and soaring arched windows. A circular driveway curved through grounds that had once been manicured, but now hosted an ecosystem of desert plants and tumbleweeds. Margaret gasped. "Harold, it's beautiful." Janet pulled up to ornate iron gates that hung open on rusted hinges. "Built in 1950, won by Arthur Goldstein, some movie producer. Sold it in the 70s to Vincent Torres, a businessman from Mexico City. Torres lived here as a recluse until he died in 2003. Place has been empty ever since." They walked through rooms that belonged in architectural magazines, 20-foot ceilings, hand-painted tilework, a kitchen large enough to serve a restaurant. The master suite featured a fireplace and French doors opening onto a terrace overlooking the desert valley. Every surface was thick with dust, every corner draped in cobwebs, but the bones of the house were magnificent. "The asking price includes all furnishings," Janet explained, gesturing to chairs and tables covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. "Most of it's probably antiques, though I couldn't tell you what condition they're in." Harold wandered through a library-lined floor to ceiling with books, most of them in Spanish. Margaret explored a sunroom where light filtered through windows that hadn't been cleaned in decades, painting rainbow patterns on the tile floor. In the formal dining room, a chandelier the size of a small car hung suspended over a table that could seat 20. "Why so cheap?" Harold asked finally. Janet's expression grew uncomfortable. "Honestly, because nobody wants it. Too remote, too big, too expensive to maintain. And there are stories." "What kind of stories?" "Vincent Torres was involved in some kind of business that attracted the wrong attention. Died suddenly, no family anyone could locate. Some folks say they've seen lights in the windows, even though there's no power. Others claim they've heard voices." Margaret appeared at Harold's elbow. "Voices saying what?" Janet shrugged. "Nothing specific. Just voices. Look, I'm required to disclose that some people consider the property haunted. Personally, I think it's just an old house making old house noises, but I figured you should know." They completed the tour in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The house was massive, overwhelming, and completely impractical for two elderly people on a fixed income. The nearest grocery store was 40 minutes away. The heating bills alone would probably exceed their entire monthly income. It was also the most beautiful place either of them had ever imagined living. Standing on the front terrace as the afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since receiving that pension letter. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind, but something deeper, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they were supposed to be here. "What do you think?" he asked Margaret. She was quiet for a long moment, her teacher's mind undoubtedly calculating utilities, maintenance costs, and all the practical reasons this was impossible. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but certain. "I think we're tired of being practical." They made an offer that evening, $25,000, everything they had, plus a small loan against their Honda. Janet seemed genuinely surprised when they signed the papers. "You folks sure about this?" "It's a big commitment at your age." Harold looked at Margaret, seeing in her eyes the same mix of terror and excitement he felt. "We're sure." The phone call to their daughter Sarah went about as well as expected. "You bought a what? Where?" Sarah's voice crackled through the phone with barely contained hysteria. "A mansion in Mirage Springs," Margaret repeated patiently. "It's quite lovely, actually. Spanish colonial style, very spacious." "Mom, have you lost your minds? You're 70 years old. You can't just move to some ghost town in the middle of nowhere." Harold took the phone. "Sarah, we couldn't afford to stay in Phoenix. This gives us a chance to own something outright, no rent payments. So move to a retirement community, or a nice apartment. Not some haunted mansion in the desert." Sarah's voice rose with each word. "What are people going to think?" And there it was, Sarah's real concern. Not their safety or happiness, but appearances. How would it look to her friends that her parents had moved to a derelict mansion in a nowhere town? "We're not making this decision based on what other people think," Harold said quietly. "Well, you should be. This is embarrassing, Dad. I have a reputation to maintain, clients who know about my family. I can't have people thinking my parents are some kind of desert hermits living in a haunted house." The conversation went downhill from there. Sarah threatened to have them declared mentally incompetent. She accused them of making decisions out of spite. She hung up, promising to call their doctor and demand a psychiatric evaluation. Margaret sat heavily in her chair after Harold ended the call. "She's ashamed of us. She's ashamed of the situation," Harold corrected gently. "There's a difference." But Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Our own daughter thinks we're crazy." Harold knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Maybe we are a little crazy, but we've spent our whole lives being sensible, responsible, practical. Where did it get us? Broke and forgotten in a one-bedroom apartment, counting out pills to make the prescription last longer." Margaret wiped her eyes. "You really think we can make this work?" Harold looked around their tiny apartment, at the water stain on the ceiling that maintenance had ignored for months, at the windows that faced the dumpster behind the building. Then he thought of the mansion's soaring ceilings, its library full of books, the way the desert sunset had painted everything in gold through those massive windows. "I think we have to try." Word of their purchase spread through their old neighborhood faster than Harold had expected. The reactions ranged from bewilderment to outright mockery. At the grocery store, their former neighbor Ellen stopped them with barely concealed glee. "Harold! Margaret! I heard the most ridiculous rumor. Someone said you bought some old mansion in the desert." "Please tell me that's not true." Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "It's true. We're moving next week." Ellen's eyes widened with delight at having gossip confirmed. "But why? I mean, at your age, wouldn't a nice senior community make more sense?" "We wanted space," Harold said. "Simply. And privacy. But what about medical care, shopping? What if something happens to one of you out there in the middle of nowhere?" These were all valid concerns, ones that kept Harold awake at night. But he was tired of defending their choice to people who seemed more interested in their failure than their well-being. "We'll manage," he said. Ellen shook her head, as if their decision personally offended her. "Well, I suppose everyone has to make their own mistakes. I just hope you know what you're doing." After she left, Margaret was quiet for a long time. "Maybe she's right," she said finally. "Maybe we are making a mistake." Harold stopped, pushing the cart, and turned to face his wife. "Maggie, do you remember why we became teachers? To help children learn. And do you remember what we told kids who were afraid to try new things?" Margaret's eyes softened. "That making mistakes is how we grow." "Well," Harold said, resuming their shopping, "I guess it's time to practice what we preached." The move itself was simpler than expected, mostly because they owned so little worth taking. 47 years of marriage reduced to boxes that fit easily in a rented trailer. Books, photo albums, Margaret's collection of ceramic birds, Harold's tools, and enough furniture to fill maybe 3 rooms of their new home. As they pulled away from the apartment complex where they'd lived for 5 unhappy years, Harold felt no sadness, only relief. Whatever awaited them in Mirage Springs, it had to be better than the slow suffocation of poverty in a place where nobody cared whether they lived or died. The drive through the desert was different this time, their possessions trailing behind them like a declaration of faith. Margaret navigated while Harold drove, calling out landmarks and mile markers as they left the city behind and entered landscape that grew more beautiful and alien with each mile. "Look," Margaret said softly, pointing to a hawk circling overhead. "It's following us." Harold glanced up through the windshield. The bird did seem to be keeping pace with their little convoy, its wings barely moving as it rode the thermal currents. "Maybe it's welcoming us home," he said. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "Home. I like the sound of that." They arrived at the mansion as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible to anyone accustomed to city smog. The iron gate stood open as they had during their first visit, but now they felt less like a barrier and more like an invitation. Harold parked in the circular driveway and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, both of them staring up at their new home. In the golden hour light, the place looked less intimidating and more majestic, as if the desert itself approved of their decision. "Ready?" Harold asked. Margaret nodded. "Ready." The first week was harder than either wanted to admit. The mansion was beautiful but overwhelming. Rooms echoed with their footsteps. The heating system, designed for a full staff to maintain, consumed propane at an alarming rate. The nearest grocery store was indeed 40 minutes away, and Harold found himself making the drive every other day for forgotten essentials. But there were unexpected compensations. The silence was profound, in a way that city dwellers couldn't imagine. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. At night, the sky revealed stars that had been invisible in Phoenix, so many that Margaret gasped the first time she stepped outside after dark. "I'd forgotten the sky could look like this," she whispered. They established routines. Harold tackled maintenance issues room by room, his high school shop classes coming back like muscle memory. Margaret organized and cleaned, discovering treasures among the draped furniture, hand-carved chairs from Mexico, paintings by artists whose signatures neither recognized but whose work spoke to something deep inside them. In the library, she found journals and photo albums left behind by the previous owner. Vincent Torres had been a thin man with kind eyes, who smiled rarely in pictures. The albums showed him entertaining guests in the mansion's heyday, elegant dinner parties on the terrace, celebrations around the swimming pool when it was filled with clear blue water instead of tumbleweeds. But as the photos progressed chronologically, the guests disappeared. The later pictures showed Vincent alone, sometimes with a distant expression that Margaret found unsettling. The final photos in the last album were of the mansion itself, room after room, photographed, as if for insurance purposes, or perhaps as a final record of something that would soon be lost. "Harold," Margaret called one evening as she explored the kitchen pantry. "Come look at this." He found her standing in front of a wall of shelves that held an impressive collection of canned goods, all expired but still sealed. Enough food to last months, maybe years. Why would one man need all this? Margaret wondered. Harold examined the dates on the labels. Most expired in 2002 or 2003, around the time Vincent Torres had died. Maybe he was sick, or maybe he just liked being prepared, but the discovery bothered them both. Combined with the mansion's remote location, the elaborate security system Harold had discovered but didn't understand, and the stories about Vincent's mysterious death, it painted a picture of a man who had been hiding from something. Their second week brought visitors. Harold was repairing a loose board on the front steps when a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. Two men got out, one elderly with a weathered face and work clothes, the other younger, with the soft look of someone who'd never done physical labor. "You folks, the ones bought Vincent's place?" the older man asked. "We are," Harold replied, setting down his hammer. "Harold Brennan, this is my wife, Margaret. Name's Pete Morales. This here's my nephew, Danny. We live down the hill about 2 miles. Pete's eyes swept over the mansion with something approaching reverence. "Haven't seen the place this lively in 20 years. Danny stepped forward with the aggressive friendliness of a used car salesman. "We heard you folks might be looking to sell some of the furnishings. There's a good market for authentic Mexican colonial pieces." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression polite but wary. "We're not looking to sell anything right now. We're still settling in." Course, Danny said quickly. "Just thought we'd introduce ourselves, let you know we're here if you need anything. This desert can be tough on folks not used to it." Pete elbowed his nephew sharply. "What Danny means is, we wanted to welcome you proper. Town doesn't get many new residents." They chatted for a few more minutes about the weather, the isolation, the challenges of maintaining a large property. But Harold noticed Danny's eyes constantly moving, cataloging the visible furnishings, the artwork, the obvious signs of wealth that previous owners had left behind. After they left, Margaret voiced the concern they both felt. "They seemed more interested in our things than in welcoming us." Harold nodded. "Word's probably spread about 2 old teachers buying Vincent's place. People might think we're sitting on a fortune." "Are we?" Margaret asked. Harold considered the question. The furniture alone was probably worth more than they'd paid for the house. The artwork, the books, the elaborate fixtures, it was impossible to estimate without professional appraisal. But something about Danny's hungry expression made him reluctant to find out. "Let's just say we're comfortable," he said finally. That night, Harold was awakened by a sound he couldn't identify, a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood, coming from somewhere deep in the house. He lay still for several minutes, listening, but the sound faded as mysteriously as it had begun. "Did you hear that?" Margaret whispered beside him. "Probably just the house settling," Harold replied, though he didn't believe it himself. The next morning, Margaret found a door they hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a bookshelf in what had been Vincent Torres's study. The door was locked, secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than anything else in the house. "Harold, look at this." He examined the lock, noting that it was a high-security model that would require special tools to cut. Strange place for a lock this heavy. Margaret ran her fingers along the doorframe. "And look, this door doesn't match the others. The wood is different. Newer." Someone added this after the house was built. Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert morning air. "Maybe we should call a locksmith." "Maybe we should," Margaret agreed. But when Harold drove to town that afternoon to find a locksmith, he discovered that Mirage Springs didn't have one. The nearest was in Phoenix, and the cost of the service call would strain their already tight budget. "I could cut the lock," Pete Morales suggested when Harold asked at the general store. "Got a good pair of bolt cutters in my truck." Something about Pete's eagerness made Harold uncomfortable. "Thanks, but I think we'll manage." That evening, as they sat in the mansion's grand living room reading by lamplight, Margaret brought up the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Harold, what if there's a reason this place was so cheap? What if Vincent Torres hid something here?" Harold looked up from his book. "What kind of something?" "I don't know. Money? Documents? Something valuable enough that he put a special lock on that door." Harold considered this. Vincent Torres had lived as a recluse, stockpiled food, and died under mysterious circumstances. The mansion was filled with expensive items, but had sold for a fraction of its apparent worth. And now they'd discovered a locked room that had been concealed behind furniture. "If there is something," Harold said carefully, "we need to be smart about it. No involving the neighbors, no asking questions around town." Margaret nodded. Just us," Harold agreed. 3 nights later, Harold was awakened again by the tapping sound. This time, he got up to investigate. Margaret followed him through the moonlit hallways, their bare feet silent on the tile floors. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the locked door. They stood in Vincent's study, listening. Tap, 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 rhythmic and persistent, like someone trying to communicate. "It's coming from behind the door," Margaret whispered. Harold nodded, his heart pounding. "But that's impossible. It's just a room." The tapping stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making the sound had heard them. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against their eardrums. "Harold," Margaret said softly, "I think we need to open that door." Harold looked at his wife, 70 years old and wearing a faded nightgown, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She looked fragile in the moonlight. But her eyes held the same determination that had carried her through decades of challenging students and difficult parents. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll find a way tomorrow." They returned to bed, but neither slept. Both lay awake listening for the tapping to resume, but the house remained silent for the rest of the night. The next morning, Harold drove to a hardware store in the nearest real town, 40 minutes east of Mirage Springs. He returned with a powerful electric grinder and cutting discs, the kind of equipment that could slice through any lock. "You sure about this?" Margaret asked as Harold plugged in the tool. "No," he admitted, "but we can't live wondering what's behind that door." The lock proved more stubborn than expected. It took Harold 20 minutes of careful cutting, sparks flying and metal shrieking, before the padlock finally fell away. He set down the grinder and looked at Margaret. "Last chance to change your minds," he said. Margaret reached for the door handle. "We've come this far." The door opened easily once the lock was removed, revealing not a room but a staircase descending into darkness. Cool air flowed up from below, carrying a strange metallic scent that made Margaret think of old coins. Harold retrieved a flashlight from his toolbox. "Stay behind me." They descended step by step into what was clearly a basement that hadn't appeared on any of the house plans they'd seen. The space was larger than expected, with concrete walls and a floor that looked recently swept. But what made them both stop cold wasn't the size of the room. It was what filled it. Along one wall stood a series of steel cabinets, each labeled with dates and numbers in Vincent Torres's careful handwriting. Against another wall, boxes were stacked floor to ceiling, all neatly organized and covered with protective plastic. And in the center of the room, Harold's flashlight beam revealed something that made his hands shake, a desk with an open journal, as if Vincent Torres had just stepped away for a moment. Margaret moved to the desk, while Harold examined the steel cabinets. The journal was filled with entries in Spanish and English, documenting what appeared to be an extensive collection of valuable items. But it was the final entry that made Margaret's breath catch. "If someone is reading this, then I am dead, and my sins have finally found me. What you see here represents 30 years of trying to make amends for choices I cannot undo. I pray that whoever finds this will use it wisely, that perhaps some good can come from my failures. The key to the vault is hidden where only the desperate would look, in the one place a man faces his truest self." Margaret looked up at Harold, who was staring into an open steel cabinet. "Harold, what is it?" He turned toward her, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "Maggie, I think we've found more than just a hidden room." She crossed to where he stood and peered into the cabinet. Inside were stacks of cash, still in bank bands, along with what looked like gold bars and documents in protective sleeves. "Dear God," Margaret whispered. Harold opened another cabinet, then another. Each one contained similar treasures: money, precious metals, artwork, jewelry. The magnitude of what they were seeing slowly began to sink in. They had stumbled into more than a basement. They had discovered a vault containing what appeared to be millions of dollars in cash and valuables, hidden by a man who had died 20 years ago and left no living relatives. Margaret sank into the chair at Vincent's desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Harold, what do we do?" Harold continued opening cabinets, his teacher's mind, automatically trying to catalog what he was seeing, but the numbers were overwhelming. Even a conservative estimate suggested they were looking at more wealth than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I honestly don't know." Above them, the mansion waited in silence, keeping its secrets as it had for 2 decades. But now those secrets belonged to Harold and Margaret Brennan, two retired teachers who had come to the desert, looking for a place to live out their final years in peace. What they had found instead was a mystery that would change everything and perhaps place them in more danger than they could possibly imagine. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Sonoran desert, Harold and Margaret stood in Vincent Torres's hidden vault, surrounded by more wealth than they had ever dreamed possible, and began to understand that their simple plan for a quiet retirement had just become infinitely more complicated. The tapping they had heard in the nights wasn't the house settling. It had been Vincent Torres's legacy, calling to them from beneath the floor, waiting for someone trustworthy enough to find it. Whether they were trustworthy enough to handle what came next remained to be seen. Margaret's hands trembled as she set down Vincent Torres's journal, the weight of his final words settling over the basement like desert dust. Harold stood frozen beside the open steel cabinet, his flashlight beam revealing stacks of currency so perfectly preserved they looked freshly minted. The silence in the vault was absolute, broken only by their shallow breathing and the distant whisper of desert wind through the mansion above. "How much do you think is here?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. Harold forced himself to move, examining the next cabinet in the row. Inside, gold bars lay arranged like books in a library, each one stamped with official markings and serial numbers. His teacher's mind, trained to count and organize, tried to calculate what he was seeing, but the numbers grew too large, too impossible. "More than we could count," he said finally. "More than we could spend in 10 lifetimes." Margaret stood on unsteady legs and joined him at the cabinets. The third one contained jewelry, not costume pieces, but genuine artifacts that belonged in museums. Emerald necklaces that caught their flashlight beam like captured starlight. Diamond bracelets, heavy enough to strain a woman's wrist. Ancient gold coins from civilizations Margaret had only read about in history books. "Harold," she breathed, lifting a ruby ring the size of a marble. "This isn't just money, these are treasures." The fourth cabinet made them both step back in shock. Inside were documents, birth certificates, passports, driver's licenses, all in different names, all bearing Vincent Torres's photograph. Dozens of identities, each one complete with supporting paperwork that looked authentic enough to fool government agencies. He wasn't just hiding money, Harold realized. He was hiding himself. Margaret picked up one of the passports, studying Vincent's familiar face above an unfamiliar name. Eduardo Vasquez, age 38. She flipped to another. Roberto Martinez, age 42. The dates overlapped, suggesting Vincent had maintained multiple identities simultaneously for years. "What kind of man needs this many different names?" Margaret asked. Harold didn't answer immediately. He was reading documents from a folder labeled "Insurance Files" in Vincent's careful handwriting. Bank statements from accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and countries Harold had never heard of. Investment portfolios worth millions. Property deeds for mansions, hotels, and businesses across 3 continents. But it was the newspaper clippings that made Harold's blood run cold. Drug Lord Vincent, the ghost. Torres vanishes after federal raid. The headline was dated December 15, 1997. Below it, a grainy photograph showed a younger Vincent Torres being escorted to a courthouse in handcuffs. "Maggie," Harold said quietly, "I think we need to see the rest of this." Margaret moved to his side as he spread more clippings across Vincent's desk. The story emerged piece by piece. Vincent Torres had been one of Mexico's most successful money launderers, washing drug cartel profits through a network of legitimate businesses. For 15 years, he'd moved billions of dollars for some of the most dangerous criminals in North America. But according to the articles, something had changed in 1997. Vincent had disappeared during a federal raid on his Mexico City headquarters, taking with him what investigators estimated to be over $200 million in cartel assets. "He stole from the cartels," Margaret whispered. Harold nodded grimly. "And then he ran." They continued reading, in horrified fascination. Vincent Torres, if that was even his real name, had vanished completely after the raid. No trace, no leads, no body. The cartels had posted a $50 million bounty for his capture. The FBI had him on their most wanted list for financial crimes. But somehow, he'd managed to disappear entirely. Until now, Harold and Margaret understood why. Vincent Torres had fled to the most isolated place he could find, a forgotten desert town where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. He'd bought the mansion under yet another false identity and lived there as a recluse for 6 years, surrounded by the fortune he'd stolen from some of the world's most dangerous people. "Look at this," Margaret said, holding up a letter from a folder marked Personal Correspondence. It was written in Spanish, but she could make out enough words to understand its meaning. "It's from someone named Elena Torres. She's asking about her father." Harold examined the letter, his high school Spanish coming back slowly. "She says she hasn't heard from him in 5 years. She's worried something's happened." Margaret found more letters from Elena, along with photographs. A young woman with Vincent's eyes and smile, graduation pictures, wedding photos, images of children who would be Vincent's grandchildren. The correspondence painted a picture of a daughter desperate to reconnect with a father who had vanished from her life. But the most devastating discovery came in a letter Vincent had written but never sent, dated just 3 days before his death according to the newspaper obituary they'd found upstairs. "My dearest Elena," Harold read aloud, translating slowly. "By the time you read this, I will be gone, and perhaps it is for the best. I know you have wondered why I disappeared, why I stopped calling, why I couldn't be the father you deserved. The truth is that I became someone I never wanted you to know. I got involved with very bad people, and the only way to protect you and your children was to disappear completely. I pray that someday you will understand that everything I did, the good and the terrible, was to ensure you could live safely, without the shadow of my choices falling across your life." Margaret wiped tears from her eyes. He died without ever sending it, because if he had, she would have tried to find him, Harold realized. And that would have put her in danger. They found more evidence of Vincent's internal struggle throughout the vault, medical records showing treatment for severe depression and anxiety, prescription bottles for medications used to treat trauma and guilt, a therapist's report recommending that Vincent consider returning the stolen money, though it noted the obvious impossibility of doing so safely. But perhaps the most revealing discovery was Vincent's personal journal, distinct from the ledger documenting his hidden wealth. The entries painted a portrait of a man consumed by regret, struggling daily with the knowledge that his survival had come at the cost of his humanity. January 3, 2000. Margaret read from one entry. "Another sleepless night. I hear Elena's voice in the wind, asking why I abandoned her. How do I explain that I wanted to be her father more than anything, but being my daughter would have meant becoming a target? How do I tell her that the cartels would have used her to get to me, that my love for her required me to become a stranger?" The entries continued for months, years, chronicling Vincent's growing isolation and despair. He wrote about walking the halls of the mansion at night, unable to sleep, haunted by the lives he'd destroyed through his money laundering operations. He documented his failed attempts to find a way to anonymously return the stolen money, frustrated by the impossibility of doing so without revealing his location. March 15, 2001. Harold read from another entry. "Saw Elena's wedding announcement in a Mexico City newspaper I had delivered. She looked beautiful, happy, free. She took her husband's name. Perhaps now she can truly escape the shadow of mine. I wanted to send flowers, a gift, some sign that her father was thinking of her on the most important day of her life. But the greatest gift I can give her is my continued absence." Margaret found herself crying openly. This poor man. He spent 6 years in this beautiful house, surrounded by more wealth than most people could imagine, and he was completely miserable. Harold discovered another section of the vault they'd missed initially, a wall lined with safety deposit boxes, each one labeled with dates and locations. The first box contained photographs and documents related to a children's hospital in Guatemala. According to Vincent's notes, he'd anonymously donated $5 million to fund a new cancer treatment wing. "Look at this," Harold called Margaret over. He was giving it away. Box after box revealed similar charitable donations, all made anonymously through untraceable accounts. Orphanages in Mexico, drug treatment centers in Colombia, educational foundations for children whose parents had been killed by cartel violence. Vincent Torres had spent the last 6 years of his life trying to transform stolen money into something that could heal the damage cartels caused. He was trying to make amends, Margaret realized. But he could never do enough, Harold added, reading through Vincent's calculations. He'd given away almost $30 million, but there were still nearly $200 million left. And every year he waited, the danger grew worse. They found evidence of that growing danger in a box labeled "Security Concerns," letters from private investigators who'd been hired to find Vincent. Police reports from towns throughout the American Southwest, documenting cartel operatives asking questions about mysterious wealthy recluses. A map of Arizona with Mirage Springs circled in red, along with a note dated 6 months before Vincent's death. "They're getting closer. Time running out." Margaret shivered. "They were hunting him, right up until he died," Harold confirmed. "Look at this." He showed her Vincent's final journal entry, dated the day before his death. "Elena called the house today. Somehow, she found the number. I didn't answer, but I recorded her voice. She said she loves me, that she forgives me for leaving, that she just wants to know I'm alive. I wanted to pick up that phone more than I've wanted anything in 20 years, but I can't. The moment I make contact, I put her in danger. Better that she thinks her father is dead than know he's a coward who abandoned her to save himself." "But he didn't abandon her to save himself," Margaret protested. "He abandoned her to save her." Harold nodded. The distinction probably didn't matter to him. They spent another hour exploring the vault, each discovery adding layers to Vincent Torres's tragic story. They found evidence that he'd been planning to fake his own death and disappear again, leaving the remaining fortune to be distributed to his various charitable causes. Legal documents, already signed and notarized, that would have triggered massive anonymous donations to organizations fighting drug addiction and cartel violence. But Vincent had died before he could execute his final plan, a heart attack brought on, according to the medical examiner's report, by acute stress and years of untreated anxiety. He died alone in the mansion, his body not discovered for 3 days, until a worried delivery driver had called the sheriff. "He spent 6 years planning his own erasure," Harold said softly, and then his heart gave out before he could finish. Margaret found the most heartbreaking evidence in the final safety deposit box, a recorded message on a small digital device. Labeled simply, "For Elena." With shaking hands, she pressed play. Vincent's voice filled the vault, speaking in Spanish, heavily accented with grief. "My beloved daughter, if you are hearing this, then I am finally free of the fear that has ruled my life since I disappeared. I know you must have many questions, and I wish I could answer them all in person. But the men I stole from are very dangerous, and as long as I lived, you and your children would never be truly safe." The recording continued for nearly 20 minutes, Vincent explaining his involvement with the cartels, his decision to steal and disappear, and his desperate hope that Elena could build a life untainted by his choices. At the end, his voice broke completely. "I want you to know that not a day passed that I didn't think of you. Every sunrise reminded me of the mornings I used to make you breakfast before school. Every sunset reminded me of the bedtime stories I'll never get to read to your children. I disappeared because I loved you too much to destroy your life with my presence. I hope someday you can forgive a father who chose your safety over his own happiness." Margaret turned off the device and sat in silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Vincent's sacrifice. Harold found her crying quietly, shoulders shaking with the weight of a stranger's pain that had become their own. "What do we do with all this?" Margaret asked finally. Harold looked around the vault at the money, the treasures, the documents, the evidence of a man's life torn apart by impossible choices. "I don't know. But I understand now why he wrote that note about finding someone worthy. He wasn't just hiding money, he was hiding a mission. Margaret wiped her eyes. You think he wanted whoever found this to finish what he started? I think he hoped someone would, Harold replied. Someone who could do what he couldn't, use this money to help people without putting themselves or their families at risk. They climbed the stairs back to the mansion proper as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the western mountains. The house felt different now that they understood its history. Every room where Vincent had walked alone, every window where he'd stood watching for enemies who never stopped searching, every silence that had hidden a heart breaking slowly under the weight of impossible love. Harold, Margaret said as they stood in the kitchen, still overwhelmed by what they'd discovered. We're just two retired teachers from Phoenix. How are we supposed to handle something like this? Harold poured them both glasses of water with hands that still trembled slightly. I don't know, but maybe that's exactly why we're the right people for this. What do you mean? Vincent Torres was a financial expert, a criminal, a man connected to dangerous people. Every decision he made was calculated to protect himself or his daughter from threats we can't even imagine. But maybe what this situation needs isn't someone sophisticated or connected or powerful. Margaret looked at him questioningly. Maybe it needs two people who know how to teach. Harold continued. People who've spent their lives taking complicated things and making them simple enough for children to understand. People who care more about doing right than looking smart. Margaret considered this. You think we can figure out how to finish Vincent's work? I think we have to try, Harold replied. That money down there represents 20 years of suffering, Vincent's suffering, his daughter's suffering, the suffering of everyone whose lives were destroyed by the cartels he worked for. If we just walk away, let it sit there for another 20 years, then Vincent's sacrifice meant nothing. That evening, they sat in Vincent's study, surrounded by his books and personal papers, trying to process everything they'd learned. The journal lay open between them, its pages filled with a dead man's anguish and hope. Margaret picked up one of the photographs of Elena Torres, a young woman laughing in a garden somewhere, children playing at her feet, no shadow of her father's choices visible in her bright expression. She never knew, Margaret said softly. She spent 20 years wondering why her father disappeared, and she never knew he was protecting her. Harold nodded. And now she never will, unless we tell her. But Vincent didn't want her to know. He died protecting that secret. Vincent died before he could execute his final plan, Harold corrected, before he could distribute the money to help people. Maybe his real wish wasn't to keep Elena in the dark forever. Maybe it was to finish cleaning up the mess his life created, so she could know the truth without being in danger. Margaret studied the photograph again. Elena Torres looked to be in her 40s, now a successful woman with a family and a life untouched by cartel violence. Her father's greatest achievement wasn't the fortune he'd stolen, but the daughter he'd raised who could smile without looking over her shoulder. How do we even begin? Margaret asked. Harold opened another of Vincent's journals, this one, filled with contact information for charitable organizations, lawyers who specialized in anonymous donations, and detailed plans for distributing large sums without creating paper trails that could lead back to the donors. We start by learning, Harold said. Vincent spent 6 years figuring out how to give this money away safely. He left us the roadmap. Margaret looked around the study at the books on international law, financial privacy, and charitable foundations. At the files filled with research on organizations fighting drug addiction and cartel violence. At the evidence of a guilty man's desperate attempt to transform stolen wealth into social good. It's going to be dangerous, she said. Probably, Harold agreed. But so was buying a mansion in the desert when everyone said we were too old and too poor to make it work. Margaret smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she'd managed since discovering the vault. We've made it this far. We've made it this far, Harold echoed. Outside, the desert wind picked up as evening settled over the Sonoran landscape. The mansion, which had kept Vincent Torres's secrets for 20 years, now sheltered 2 new guardians of those secrets. Harold and Margaret Brennan, retired teachers who'd come to the desert looking for a quiet place to live out their final years, had instead inherited a mission that would define whatever time they had left. In the basement vault, $200 million in cash, gold, and priceless artifacts waited patiently for justice. Above ground, Vincent Torres's personal papers and journals provided the roadmap for transforming stolen wealth into healing. And in the study where Vincent had spent his final years planning his own disappearance, Harold and Margaret began planning something far more ambitious, not how to hide from Vincent's legacy, but how to honor it. They had no way of knowing that their discovery would soon attract attention from people who'd been searching for Vincent's fortune for over 20 years. They couldn't foresee the danger that would come knocking at their door within days. They didn't understand that some secrets are kept hidden not because they're valuable, but because they're deadly. All they knew was that a lonely man had died, hoping someone worthy would find his hidden treasure and use it to heal the wounds his life had opened. Harold and Margaret intended to be worthy of that trust, whatever the cost. As the stars emerged over the desert sky, brilliant and countless in the clear air, the mansion settled into another night of silence. But this time, the silence felt different. Not the heavy quiet of secrets buried, but the expectant hush of secrets preparing to be revealed. Vincent Torres had spent 6 years preparing for death. Now Harold and Margaret would spend however long it took preparing for life, a life dedicated to finishing what a guilty man couldn't complete, to transforming blood money into hope. The first phase of their education began that night, as they read through Vincent's journals by lamplight, learning the intricate details of how a fortune stolen from cartels could be returned to the communities those cartels had destroyed. They had no way of knowing that within a week, their quiet research would be interrupted by visitors who'd been tracking Vincent's stolen money for over 2 decades. But for now, in the peaceful hours before dawn, Harold and Margaret Brennan sat in Vincent Torres's study and began the most important lesson plan of their teaching careers. How to turn a dead man's guilt into living justice, one careful step at a time. The desert had brought them here for a reason. They were beginning to understand what that reason might be. The morning Harold and Margaret began cataloging the full scope of Vincent Torres's hidden fortune, they had no idea they were being watched. Through high-powered binoculars positioned in the desert hills surrounding the mansion, 3 men in expensive suits observed every movement, every trip to the basement, every moment the elderly couple spent in what they believed was private contemplation. Marcus Vega lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. 72 hours since his surveillance team had confirmed the vault's location, 48 hours since thermal imaging had revealed the basement's true dimensions. 24 hours since audio equipment had picked up Harold and Margaret's hushed conversations about Vincent Torres's stolen cartel money. "How much longer do we wait?" asked his associate, a thin man named Carlos, whose patience had worn threadbare. Marcus studied the mansion through the desert heat shimmer. "Until we know exactly what they've found and exactly how much they know. Moving too fast is how Torres slipped away from us the first time." Inside the mansion, Harold was experiencing the overwhelming reality of Vincent's methodical record-keeping. Each safety deposit box in the vault contained detailed inventories of its contents, complete with current market valuations and provenance documentation. Box after box revealed treasures that belonged in museums, Mayan artifacts worth millions, emeralds from Colombian mines that no longer existed, gold coins from Spanish shipwrecks, artwork stolen by Nazis and recovered by Vincent through channels Harold preferred not to contemplate. "Listen to this," Margaret called from where she sat, cross-legged on the vault floor, surrounded by financial documents. Vincent documented every single transaction: bank transfers, currency exchanges, purchases, sales, everything. It's like he was preparing for an audit that would never come. Harold examined a ledger filled with Vincent's careful calculations. He was tracking the source of every dollar. "Look, this section shows money taken specifically from drug sales in Phoenix. This one documents profits from human trafficking operations in Texas. He wasn't just stealing randomly, he was targeting their most heinous income streams. Margaret found herself both fascinated and horrified by Vincent's meticulous documentation. Each entry told a story of suffering transformed into numbers, of human misery converted into profit margins that Vincent had then stolen and tried to redirect toward healing. "Here's something interesting," Harold said, opening a box labeled Future Distribution Plans. Inside were detailed proposals for using specific portions of the fortune to address damage caused by the very crimes that had generated the money. $5 million, designated for rehabilitation centers in communities where the cartels sold drugs. $10 million, for witness protection programs for families who testified against cartel operations. $15 million, for education programs in areas where cartels recruited children. He spent 6 years planning how to give it all away, Margaret realized. Every dollar accounted for, every distribution designed to heal specific wounds, Harold continued, reading through Vincent's plans, growing more impressed and more overwhelmed with each page. The scope of the operation Vincent had envisioned was staggering, not just charitable donations, but a comprehensive program to systematically address the damage cartels had inflicted across North America over decades. "Margaret, look at this total," Harold said, his voice barely a whisper. She moved to his shoulder and read the figure at the bottom of Vincent's master ledger. $223,478,612. Plus assets whose value fluctuated with markets but currently totaled approximately $50 million more. Nearly $300 million, Margaret breathed. "Harold, that's more money than our entire school district's annual budget, more than most small towns see in a decade." The magnitude of their responsibility was beginning to sink in. This wasn't just a windfall, it was a financial instrument capable of changing thousands of lives, healing communities, creating opportunities where none had existed. But it was also blood money, stolen from people who would kill to recover it, hidden by a man who had died rather than face the consequences of his choices. "What gives us the right to decide how this money gets used?" Margaret asked, voicing the moral dilemma that had been growing in both their minds. Harold was quiet for a long time, studying photographs Vincent had included, with his documentation pictures of children who died from cartel drugs, families destroyed by cartel violence, communities devastated by cartel corruption. Maybe it's not about having the right, maybe it's about having the responsibility. But we didn't earn this money. We didn't suffer the losses it's supposed to compensate for. We're just two people who stumbled into someone else's guilty conscience. Harold looked at his wife, seeing in her eyes the same uncertainty that churned in his own heart. "Then maybe that's exactly why we're the right people for this. We don't have a personal stake in the outcome. We don't stand to benefit from any particular decision. We can make choices based on what's right, not what's profitable." Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the gravel driveway. Harold climbed the stairs quickly and peered through the front windows to see 3 black SUVs parking in their circular drive. Men in dark suits emerged from each vehicle, their movements coordinated and purposeful. "Margaret," Harold called down to the vault, "we have company." She joined him at the window as the men arranged themselves around the mansion's entrances, not surrounding it aggressively, but positioning themselves with the casual efficiency of professionals who expected compliance rather than resistance. The leader approached the front door alone. He was tall and lean, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothes that suggested significant resources. When he knocked, the sound echoed through the mansion like a judge's gavel. Harold opened the door, keeping the chain latch engaged. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but the expression never reached his pale blue eyes. "Mr. Brennan, my name is Marcus Vega. I represent certain business interests that had financial arrangements with the previous owner of this property. I believe we have matters to discuss." "What kind of matters?" Harold asked, though his churning stomach already suspected the answer. "The kind that are better discussed in private," away from the desert heat, Marcus replied. May I come in? Harold glanced back at Margaret, who had positioned herself near the phone. She shook her head slightly, a teacher's instinct warning against letting dangerous strangers into their classroom. I think we can discuss whatever you need to discuss right here, Harold said. Marcus's smile widened, becoming more predatory. Mr. Brennan, I think you may be underestimating the complexity of your situation. Vincent Torres was holding assets that belonged to my employers. Now that you've taken possession of his property, those assets have become your responsibility. We bought this house through a legal auction, Margaret said, stepping into view behind Harold. Whatever arrangements, the previous owner had died with him. Marcus studied Margaret with the same cold assessment he'd given Harold. Mrs. Brennan, I appreciate your position, but legal ownership and practical ownership are sometimes very different things. Vincent Torres spent 20 years hiding from people who don't recognize legal technicalities when it comes to recovering their property. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Harold felt his teacher instincts kicking in, the same calm authority he'd used to handle parents who tried to intimidate him into changing their children's grades. Mr. Vega, if you have legal claim to anything on this property, I suggest you contact the appropriate authorities and pursue it through proper channels. Otherwise, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave. Marcus nodded slowly, as if Harold had confirmed something he'd already suspected. I understand your position, Mr. Brennan, but I hope you'll understand mine as well. My employers have been very patient for 20 years, waiting for Vincent Torres to surface with what belongs to them. Now that he's gone and you've inherited his complications, that patience is reaching its natural conclusion. He reached into his jacket, and Harold tensed, but Marcus only produced a business card. This is my direct number. When you're ready to discuss a reasonable resolution to this situation, please call me. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous finder's fee for your cooperation. How generous? Margaret asked, surprising both men. Marcus smiled again, this time with genuine pleasure. $10 million, Mrs. Brennan, cash, immediately transferable to any account you specify. Enough to live very comfortably for the rest of your lives, with no questions asked and no further contact necessary. Harold felt his breath catch. $10 million was more money than he'd ever dreamed of having, enough to solve every financial worry they'd ever faced. But something in Marcus's tone made the offer feel more like a trap than an opportunity. And if we're not interested in your finder's fee? Harold asked. Marcus's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the conversation seemed to drop several degrees. Then I hope you'll reconsider. The desert can be very dangerous for people who aren't familiar with its risks. After Marcus and his associates left, Harold and Margaret sat in their kitchen, the business card lying on the table between them like a small white flag of surrender. $10 million, Margaret said softly. Harold, that's enough to buy a house anywhere we want. Pay for the best medical care. Leave something substantial to Sarah. Harold nodded, but his expression remained troubled. It's also less than 4% of what's actually down there. Which means Marcus Vega knows exactly how much Vincent was hiding. You think he's been watching us? I think he's been watching this house for 20 years, waiting for someone to find what Vincent hid. And now that we have, he wants to buy us off cheaply rather than take it by force. Margaret considered this, which suggests he's not completely confident he can just take it, or that he prefers to avoid violence when possible, Harold replied. But that doesn't mean he won't use it if necessary. They spent the rest of the day researching Marcus Vega online, using their slow internet connection to piece together fragments of information. What they found was disturbing but unsurprising. Vega appeared to be a legitimate businessman with interests in import-export operations, real estate development, and financial services. But reading between the lines of business journal articles and legal filings, a pattern emerged of companies that folded quickly after generating large profits, partnerships that dissolved under suspicious circumstances, and business associates who had tendency to disappear. He's a facilitator, Harold concluded, someone who helps dirty money look clean. Exactly the kind of person Vincent Torres would have worked with, and exactly the kind of person who would know how to make problems disappear, Margaret added. That evening brought a different kind of visitor. Harold answered a knock at their door to find Pete Morales standing on the front porch, hat in his hands, expression apologetic but determined. "Mr. Brennan, I hope you don't mind me stopping by so late. I wanted to talk to you and your missus about something important." Harold invited Pete in. Noting how the old man's eyes swept quickly over the mansion's interior, cataloging details he'd probably been curious about for years. "Coffee?" Margaret offered. "Thank you, ma'am. That'd be nice." Pete settled into one of the antique chairs, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Mr. Brennan, I'm going to speak plainly because I think you folks deserve honesty." "We appreciate that," Harold said. "Word's gotten around town about the visitors you had today. Expensive cars, expensive suits, the kind of people who don't usually have business in Mirage Springs." Pete paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now, I don't know what Vincent Torres left behind in this house, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I know enough about that man's history to understand that whatever it is, it's probably valuable and definitely dangerous." Margaret set down her coffee cup. "What are you suggesting, Pete?" "I'm suggesting that two retired teachers living alone in the desert might need friends. And I'm offering to be one of those friends, if you'll have me." Harold studied Pete's weathered face, seeing genuine concern beneath the casual offer. "What kind of friendship are you talking about?" Pete smiled grimly. "The kind where an old Marine who spent 2 tours in Vietnam keeps an eye on his neighbors. The kind where someone who knows every back road and hiding place in 100 square miles makes sure nobody approaches this house without you knowing about it first." "Why would you do that?" Margaret asked. "Because Vincent Torres helped my grandson when nobody else would," Pete replied. "Back in '98, my daughter's boy got mixed up with some bad people in Phoenix. Started using drugs, stealing to pay for them. Vincent somehow heard about it. I never knew how, and he made some calls, got the boy into a treatment program that saved his life. Never asked for anything in return, never even admitted he was involved, but I knew." Pete leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. "Vincent Torres might have been involved with dangerous people, but he wasn't a dangerous man. Not to folks who didn't deserve it. And if he trusted this place to you, then you're the kind of people worth protecting." Harold felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Pete, we appreciate the offer, but we don't want to put you in any danger. Mr. Brennan, I'm 78 years old. I've been shot at by professionals and survived cancer twice. If some city boys in expensive suits think they can intimidate people in my town, they're about to get an education in desert hospitality." The next morning brought evidence that Pete's offer of friendship was both timely and necessary. Margaret found tire tracks around the mansion that hadn't been there the day before, evidence that someone had conducted a thorough reconnaissance of their property during the night. Worse, Harold discovered that the lock on their basement door had been tampered with, though not successfully breached. "They're probing our defenses," Harold realized. "Testing to see how well we can protect what we've found." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning desert air. "How long do you think we have before they stop being polite about this?" "Not long," Harold replied. "Marcus Vega struck me as someone who prefers efficiency over patience." They called Pete, who arrived within an hour accompanied by 3 other men Harold didn't recognize. All were older, all carried themselves with the bearing of former military, and all looked at the tire tracks around the mansion with expressions of professional interest. "Surveillance sweep," Pete explained. "Looking for weak points, escape routes, angles of approach. Whoever did this knows what they're doing." "What do you recommend?" Harold asked. "Short-term, motion sensors, better lighting, communications equipment. Long-term?" Pete's expression grew serious. "You need to decide whether you're going to fight or fold. Because those tire tracks tell me the people you're dealing with aren't going to take no for an answer much longer." That afternoon, while Pete and his friends installed security equipment, Harold and Margaret returned to the vault to continue cataloging Vincent's hidden fortune. But now the task felt different, less like exploration and more like preparation for war. "Look at this section," Margaret said. pointing to a series of entries in Vincent's ledger. He documented every attempt to contact his daughter over the years, phone calls he placed but never completed, letters he wrote but never sent, birthday cards he bought but never mailed. Harold read over her shoulder, feeling his heart break for a man he'd never met. 20 years of wanting to reach out and never allowing himself to do it. Harold, what if we're being selfish? What if the right thing to do is just give Marcus Vega what he wants and walk away? Take the 10 million and let someone else deal with the moral complexity. Harold was quiet for a long time, studying a photograph Vincent had kept of his daughter's wedding, a picture taken with a telephoto lens from a great distance, showing Elena Torres dancing with her new husband, while her father watched from the shadows, unable to participate in her joy, but unwilling to miss it entirely. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Harold finally said. "All those students we taught over the years. All those times we had to decide whether to take the easy path or do what was right for the kids." Margaret nodded. "Even when the easy path would have made our lives simpler, even when parents threatened us, or administrators pressured us, or the school board questioned our methods." Harold continued, "We always came back to the same question. What would be best for the children in the long run? You think that applies here?" Harold gestured to the evidence of Vincent's charitable planning that surrounded them. "I think Vincent Torres spent 6 years trying to figure out how to transform blood money into healing. I think he died before he could complete that work, and I think we're the only people in a position to finish what he started." Margaret picked up Elena's wedding photograph, studying the joy on the young woman's face, joy made possible by her father's painful sacrifice. "Even if it means facing down people who would kill to stop us." "Especially then," Harold replied. "Because if we don't, who will?" Their conversation was interrupted by Pete's voice calling from upstairs. "Mr. Brennan, Mrs. Brennan, you need to see this." They climbed out of the vault to find Pete standing at the front windows, binoculars in hand. "Company coming." 3 vehicles, moving fast, kicking up a lot of dust. Harold took the binoculars and peered down the long driveway. The vehicles were white this time instead of black, and they carried markings he recognized. "News vans," Harold said. "Channel 7, Channel 12, and I can't make out the third one." Pete swore creatively. Someone leaked the story. Margaret joined them at the window as the news vans pulled into their circular driveway, disgorging reporters, cameramen, and sound technicians with the efficiency of a military operation. "How did they find out?" Margaret asked. Harold's phone rang before anyone could answer. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Brennan?" The voice was smooth, professional, familiar. "This is Marcus Vega. I see you're about to have visitors. I thought you might appreciate a friendly warning." "What kind of warning?" "The kind that suggests this situation is about to become much more complicated. Media attention tends to attract additional interest in matters like these. I hope you're prepared for the scrutiny that's coming." Harold felt a chill of understanding. "You called the news stations." "I simply made sure certain facts came to light," Marcus replied. "Sometimes public pressure can clarify decision-making in ways that private conversation cannot." Through the window, Harold watched reporters setting up cameras, while one particularly aggressive correspondent approached their front door. "What do you want, Marcus?" "The same thing I wanted yesterday, Mr. Brennan, but now the price has changed. Media attention brings complications, and complications are expensive to manage. I'm afraid my offer has decreased to $5 million. The front door erupted in rapid knocking. Outside, Harold could hear the correspondent calling, "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan, Jennifer Walsh, Channel 7 News. We'd like to speak with you about the treasure you've discovered." "You have 30 minutes to decide," Marcus continued. "After that, I'm afraid the situation will require more direct management." Harold hung up and turned to Margaret and Pete. "He's forcing our hand. Either we take his reduced offer, or he's going to make this very public and very dangerous." Pete checked his watch. "How much time?" 30 minutes, Harold replied. Margaret looked out at the growing crowd of reporters, then back at the basement entrance, where where nearly $300 million in stolen money waited for justice. What happens if we say no? What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Pete moved to the window and studied the news crews with professional assessment. Then we find out whether 2 retired teachers and some old Marines can protect $300 million worth of justice from people who've been killing for it for 20 years. Harold felt the weight of Vincent Torres's legacy pressing down on him like the desert heat. Outside, reporters were setting up for what would undoubtedly become a media circus. In 30 minutes, Marcus Vega would stop asking politely for what he wanted and start taking it by force. And somewhere in Mexico, Elena Torres continued living a life made possible by her father's sacrifice, unaware that the completion of his redemptive work now depended on 2 strangers in a desert mansion. "Margaret," Harold said quietly, "are you ready to finish what we started?" She looked at him with the same determination he'd seen in her eyes on their first day of teaching, when they'd faced a classroom full of skeptical 7-year-olds and decided to prove that learning could be an adventure. "I'm ready," she said. Pete grinned, suddenly looking more like a warrior than a retiree. "Then let's give these city boys a lesson in desert justice." Outside, the first reporter began her live broadcast. "This is Jennifer Walsh reporting from Mirage Springs, Arizona, where an elderly couple's purchase of a desert mansion has led to the discovery of what sources describe as the largest hidden treasure in state history." Harold turned away from the window. They had 28 minutes to decide the fate of Vincent Torres' stolen fortune, and, with it, the lives of thousands of people who had no idea their future hung in the balance. The weight of truth, Harold was learning, was sometimes too heavy for 2 people to carry alone, but sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found that you weren't carrying it alone after all. The desert had brought them here for a reason. They were about to find out what that reason demanded of them. 27 minutes. Harold stood at the kitchen counter, staring at Marcus Vega's business card, while the sounds of news crews setting up equipment echoed through the mansion's windows. Margaret sat at the table behind him, Vincent Torres's final journal open in her hands, reading again the words that had haunted them both since their discovery. "I pray that whoever finds this will use it wisely, that perhaps some good can come from my failures." "Harold," Margaret said softly, "I keep thinking about something Vincent wrote. He said the greatest gift he could give his daughter was his continued absence. But what if he was wrong?" Harold turned to face her. "What do you mean? What if the greatest gift he could give her was the knowledge that her father died trying to make amends? That his life meant something more than the crimes he committed?" Through the front windows, they could see reporters positioning themselves for live broadcasts. One correspondent was already speaking into her microphone, gesturing toward the mansion with dramatic flair. In a matter of minutes, their private struggle would become a public spectacle. Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression grim but determined. Vehicle approaching from the east, black sedan, moving fast. "Looks like your friend Marcus decided not to wait the full 30 minutes. Harold checked the clock on the wall. 24 minutes remaining, but Marcus Vega was clearly a man who preferred action to patience. "Pete," Harold said, "if we decide not to take his offer, what exactly are we facing?" The old Marine's expression didn't change. "Best case? Intimidation, harassment, legal pressure. Worst case?" He paused. "Well, let's just say people who steal from cartels don't usually die of old age." Margaret closed Vincent's journal and stood up. "Then we better make sure we're prepared for the worst case." Harold looked at his wife, seeing in her eyes the same quiet strength that had carried her through 30 years of challenging students, demanding parents, and a school system that never appreciated what she brought to her classroom. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure that we didn't come this far to hand over a dead man's redemption to the people he spent his life running from," Margaret replied. "I'm sure that somewhere in Mexico, Elena Torres deserves to know her father died a hero, not a coward. And I'm sure that Vincent's money can do more good in the right hands than it ever could in Marcus Vega's. Pete nodded approvingly. Then we better get you ready for company. The next 20 minutes transformed the mansion from a quiet desert retreat into something resembling a military command post. Pete's friends, retired Marines, Army veterans, and one former Navy SEAL positioned themselves strategically around the property. Motion sensors were activated, communications equipment crackled to life. And in the basement vault, Harold and Margaret made rapid decisions about the most important documents in Vincent's collection. These financial records, Margaret said, stuffing papers into a waterproof bag. The evidence of where the money came from and Vincent's plans for distributing it. Elena's contact information, Harold added, including the recording Vincent had made for his daughter. If something happens to us, she deserves to know the truth about her father. Outside, Marcus Vega's sedan pulled into the circular driveway, joining the growing crowd of news vans and satellite trucks. Through the basement windows, they could see expensive shoes approaching mansion's front entrance. Pete's voice crackled through the radio. "Showtime, folks." 3 men, all armed, trying to look casual for the cameras. Harold and Margaret climbed the stairs from the vault, sealing the basement door behind them. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just their fate, but the fate of Vincent Torres's stolen fortune and the communities it was meant to heal. The knock on the front door was polite but insistent. Harold opened it to find Marcus Vega flanked by 2 associates, all of them maintaining professional smiles for the benefit of the news cameras positioned strategically around the driveway. "Mr. Brennan," Marcus said smoothly, "I hope you've had time to consider our conversation." "We have," Harold replied. "And our answer is no." Marcus's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps you'd like to reconsider, given the complications that have developed." He gestured toward the news crews, who were capturing every moment of their conversation. "Media attention brings scrutiny, Mr. Brennan. Scrutiny brings investigations. Investigations bring questions about how 2 retired teachers on fixed incomes suddenly acquired a property containing hundreds of millions of dollars in undocumented assets." Margaret stepped into view beside Harold. "Then I guess we better have good answers to those questions." Marcus studied her with the same cold assessment he'd given Harold the day before. "Mrs. Brennan, I don't think you understand the complexity of your situation. The money you've found has a very complicated history. People have died protecting it. People have died trying to find it. I'm offering you a way to walk away from all of that complexity with your lives and your dignity intact." "No," Margaret said simply. "You're offering us a way to become accessories to theft and murder. We're not interested." Harold felt a surge of pride at his wife's calm defiance. She faced down Marcus Vega with the same unshakable composure she'd once used to handle school board members who tried to intimidate her into lowering her standards. Marcus's associates shifted slightly, their jackets opening just enough to reveal shoulder holsters. The movement was subtle, but Harold caught it. So did Pete, apparently, because his voice immediately crackled through their concealed radio earpiece. Movement in the trees, additional vehicles approaching from multiple directions. Looks like they brought reinforcements. Marcus heard the radio transmission and smiled more genuinely. "Mr. Brennan, it appears you've made some interesting friends since we last spoke. I hope they understand what they're involving themselves in." "They understand that 2 elderly people shouldn't have to face armed criminals alone," Harold replied. "Armed criminals?" Marcus laughed softly. "Mr. Brennan, we're legitimate businessmen, attempting to recover stolen property through negotiation. If we were criminals, this conversation would have ended very differently." Margaret stepped forward, surprising everyone. "You want to know what Vincent Torres told us about people like you? He said the worst criminals are the ones who convince themselves they're legitimate businessmen. The ones who dress theft in legal language and murder in business terminology." Marcus's composure cracked slightly. Vincent Torres was a thief and a coward who died alone because he betrayed people who trusted him. Vincent Torres was a father who sacrificed his life to protect his daughter from people like you." Margaret shot back. "And if you think we're going to dishonor that sacrifice by handing his legacy over to murderers, then you understand nothing about the kind of people teachers are." The standoff was broken by an unexpected development. One of the news reporters, apparently deciding that the confrontation she was witnessing was more interesting than her prepared story, approached the group with her cameraman in tow. "Excuse me," she called out. "Jennifer Walsh, Channel 7 News. Could you comment on reports that this property contains one of the largest hidden treasures ever discovered in Arizona?" Marcus turned toward the reporter, his professional mask sliding back into place. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. We're simply here to discuss property maintenance issues with the new owners." But Margaret had apparently decided that public attention might be their best protection. "Actually," she said, stepping toward the camera, "we'd be happy to comment on what we've discovered." Harold felt his heart stop. They hadn't discussed going public with their story. But as he watched his wife position herself confidently in front of the news camera, he realized she was operating on teacher instincts. Sometimes the best defense against a bully was to make sure everyone was watching. "We purchased this property 3 weeks ago," Margaret told the camera. "What we found in the property basement was evidence of the previous owner's attempts to make amends for his involvement with organized crime. Vincent Torres spent the last 6 years of his life trying to figure out how to transform stolen money into community healing. We intend to finish what he started." Marcus Vega's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, and something approaching panic. Harold realized that public disclosure was the last thing Marcus wanted. Whatever his plans had been for recovering Vincent's fortune, they required secrecy. "Mrs. Brennan," Marcus said urgently, moving toward the camera, "I don't think you understand the implications of what you're saying." But Margaret wasn't finished. "The money hidden in this house was stolen from drug cartels by a man who realized he'd spent his life helping to destroy communities. He documented everything: where the money came from, which communities were harmed, how the funds could be used to rebuild what was destroyed." Jennifer Walsh, sensing the story of her career, pressed forward with her microphone. "How much money are we talking about?" Harold stepped up beside his wife, making his own choice about their future. "Nearly $300 million. And every penny of it is going to be used exactly as Vincent Torres planned to heal the damage caused by the crimes that generated it." The reaction was immediate and chaotic. More reporters surged forward with questions. Marcus Vega and his associates retreated toward their vehicle, clearly unwilling to be further identified on camera. And from the desert around the mansion, Pete's voice crackled through their earpieces with tactical updates. "Multiple vehicles withdrawing. Looks like your publicity strategy worked. Hard to conduct kidnapping with news helicopters overhead." But Harold knew their public declaration was just the beginning of their challenges, not the end. By identifying themselves as the guardians of Vincent Torres's fortune, they'd made themselves targets for every criminal organization that had been searching for that money for 20 years. "Jennifer," Harold said to the reporter, "we're going to need to cut this short. But I promise you'll have full access to this story as it develops." After the news crews departed and Marcus Vega's people disappeared into the desert, Harold and Margaret found themselves sitting in their kitchen, surrounded by Pete and his fellow veterans, trying to process what they'd just committed themselves to. "You realize there's no going back now," Pete said gently. "By tomorrow morning, every criminal organization in North America will know exactly where Vincent's money is and exactly who has control of it." Margaret nodded. "Then we better move fast." Over the next 72 hours, Harold and Margaret orchestrated the most complex financial operation of their lives. Using Vincent's detailed plans and the contact information he'd compiled, they began the process of transforming stolen cartel money into legitimate charitable assets. The first call was to Elena Torres. Margaret made the call from Vincent's study, Harold beside her for support, Pete monitoring their security systems for any sign of approaching threats. When Elena answered, Her voice carried the same gentle strength Margaret had heard in Vincent's recordings. "Elena," Margaret said carefully, "my name is Margaret Brennan. I'm calling about your father." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Elena finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Is he alive?" "No," Margaret said gently. "But we've found evidence of everything he did to protect you, and everything he planned to do to make amends for his past. Elena, your father spent the last 6 years of his life trying to transform the money he stole into healing for the communities that were hurt by his crimes." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Elena cried. Margaret cried. Harold found himself moved to tears by the sound of a daughter finally learning that her father's disappearance had been an act of love, not abandonment. "There's something else," Margaret said near the end of their call. "Your father recorded a message for you, a final letter explaining everything. Would you like to hear it?" Elena Torres flew to Arizona the next day. She was 43 years old, a teacher herself, elementary education, just like Margaret with her father's gentle eyes, and a strength forged by 20 years of wondering why the most important man in her life had vanished without explanation. Harold and Margaret met her at the small airport in Phoenix, driving through the desert toward Mirage Springs, while Elena stared out at the landscape where her father had spent his final years. "He used to bring me here when I was little," Elena said softly. "Day trips to see the desert in bloom. I never understood why he loved this place so much. He found peace here," Margaret said, "and purpose." At the mansion, Elena walked through the rooms where her father had lived alone, touching furniture he'd touched, standing at windows where he'd watched sunsets and wondered if he'd made the right choices. When they showed her the basement vault, she stood in silence for a long time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what her father had hidden and planned. But it was Vincent's recorded message that finally broke her heart open. "My beloved Elena," his voice echoed through the vault where he'd planned his redemption. "If you are hearing this, then I am finally free of the fear that ruled my life since I disappeared." Elena listened to the complete recording, tears streaming down her face, as her father explained 20 years of painful silence. When it ended, she looked at Harold and Margaret with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me know he never stopped loving me." Elena stayed for a week, helping Harold and Margaret understand the full scope of her father's charitable plans. As a teacher herself, she brought insights into education and community development that enhanced Vincent's original vision. Together, they refined the distribution strategy, ensuring that every dollar would create maximum positive impact. "There's something I want to add to his plan," Elena said on her final night at the mansion. "My father spent 20 years thinking he'd destroyed his family legacy. But what if we created a new legacy? What if some of this money went toward establishing scholarship funds for children whose parents died in cartel violence? Children like the ones my father helped create when he was laundering their profits." Margaret felt her heart swell with admiration for Elena's wisdom and forgiveness. "Your father would love that idea." "Then let's make it part of his story," Elena replied. The Torres Foundation was established 6 months later, with Elena as its director and Harold and Margaret as advisory board members. The foundation's mission was ambitious, but precisely targeted: to heal communities damaged by cartel operations using money recovered from those same organizations. The first major initiative provided $50 million for drug treatment and prevention programs in cities across the Southwest communities, where cartel drugs had claimed thousands of lives. The money funded rehab centers, counseling programs, and educational initiatives designed to prevent children from falling into the addiction cycles that sustained cartel profits. The second initiative established the Vincent Torres Memorial Scholarship Program, providing full college funding for children whose parents had been killed by cartel violence or died from cartel drugs. Elena personally reviewed every application, looking for young people who shared her father's intelligence and conscience, but lacked his opportunities. But perhaps the most meaningful initiative was the Community Rebuilding Program, which identified neighborhoods that had been destroyed by cartel operations and provided comprehensive funding for their reconstruction. New schools, community centers, health clinics, and small business loan programs, all designed to create legitimate economic opportunities in places where cartels had previously offered the only path to financial survival. "We're not just giving money away," Elena explained to a gathering of foundation donors. "We're rebuilding the social fabric that cartels deliberately destroy. We're proving that communities can thrive without crime, that children can succeed without violence, that hope can exist where despair once ruled." Harold and Margaret found themselves transformed by their role in the foundation's work. No longer were they forgotten retirees struggling to pay rent. They became respected leaders in the philanthropic community, sought out for their insights into education and community development. But more importantly, they found purpose. Margaret established the foundation's education initiatives, drawing on 30 years of teaching experience to design programs that actually reached struggling students. Harold managed the financial oversight, ensuring that every donated dollar created measurable positive change. "You know what I realized?" Margaret said one evening as they sat on their mansion's front terrace, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "We spent our entire careers believing that teaching was about helping children learn. But maybe teaching is really about helping communities heal." Harold nodded, thinking about the letters they received from foundation beneficiaries, former addicts who'd completed treatment, students who'd graduated from college, parents who'd found legitimate jobs in rebuilt neighborhoods. Vincent Torres thought his life was a failure because of the crimes he committed. Harold replied, "But maybe the measure of a life isn't the mistakes you make. Maybe it's what you do to fix them." The transformation wasn't limited to Harold and Margaret. Mirage Springs itself began to change as word spread about the couple who'd discovered hidden treasure and chose to share it with the world rather than keep it for themselves. The town that had once been dying found new life as people moved in, drawn by the story of the mansion where redemption had been born. The old diner expanded into a full restaurant, new businesses opened. The elementary school, which had been in danger of closing, now boasted a waiting list of families who wanted their children educated in the town where two teachers had proven that moral courage could triumph over greed. Pete Morales became the unofficial mayor of the revitalized community, organizing town events and making sure newcomers understood the values that had transformed Mirage Springs from a ghost town into a destination. "It's funny," Pete said during one of their regular coffee conversations. "People come here expecting to see where you found all that money. But what they really find is proof that some things matter more than money." 3 years after their discovery, Harold and Margaret hosted the Torres Foundation's annual gala at the mansion. Elena flew in from Mexico City, where she now divided her time between foundation work and her own teaching career. Hundreds of foundation beneficiaries attended, former addicts celebrating years of sobriety, college graduates preparing for careers in medicine and law, community leaders from rebuilt neighborhoods. The evening's highlight was the presentation of Vincent Torres's final charitable distribution. Elena stood at the podium in the mansion's grand ballroom, holding a check for $50 million made out to a consortium of Central American orphanages. "My father would have been amazed to see this room tonight," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle strength that had sustained Vincent through 20 years of exile. Not because of the money he always knew. Money was just a tool. But because of the proof that guilt can become grace, that stolen wealth can become legitimate healing, that one man's mistakes can become a community's redemption. After the gala ended and the guests departed, Harold and Margaret found themselves alone in Vincent's study, surrounded by the journals and photographs that had first revealed his story to them. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Choosing this path instead of taking Marcus Vega's money and living quietly?" Harold considered the question seriously. Marcus Vega had disappeared after their public disclosure, 3 years earlier, probably to avoid the federal investigation that followed the news coverage of Vincent's hidden fortune. But Harold sometimes wondered what their life would have been like if they'd taken his $5 million and walked away from Vincent's legacy. "No," Harold said finally. "I regret that it took us 73 years to find work this meaningful. But I don't regret choosing to finish what Vincent started." Margaret picked up a letter that had arrived that morning. A note from a young woman in Guatemala, whose education was being funded by the Torres Foundation scholarship program. The letter was written in careful English, describing dreams of becoming a doctor and returning to her community to provide health care for families affected by cartel violence. "Listen to this," Margaret said, reading from the letter. She writes, "I know I will never meet the people who made my education possible, but I want them to know that their gift is not just changing my life. It is changing the lives of everyone I will help when I become a doctor." That is how kindness grows, not just in the person who receives it, but in all the people that person touches afterward. Harold felt tears building in his eyes. Vincent Torres would have loved reading that. "He is reading it," Margaret replied. "Somewhere, somehow, he knows that his daughter forgave him, that his money became healing, that his guilt became grace." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, surrounded by evidence of the legacy they'd helped create. The Torres Foundation had distributed over $200 million in 3 years, funding programs that had saved thousands of lives and rebuilt dozens of communities. But perhaps more importantly, it had proved that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary redemption when they chose courage over comfort. "Harold," Margaret said softly, "what do you think our legacy will be?" Harold looked around the study where Vincent Torres had planned his own redemption and where they had planned its completion. On the walls hung photographs from foundation projects, children graduating from schools built with cartel money transformed into hope, families moving into homes in neighborhoods rebuilt from cartel-destroyed communities, young adults receiving diplomas from colleges funded by Vincent's guilty conscience turned toward grace. "I think our legacy will be the proof that teaching never really ends," Harold said. "We spent 30 years teaching children in classrooms. Now we're teaching the world that money stolen from communities can be returned to heal them, that guilt can become grace, that 2 forgotten retirees can change thousands of lives if they're brave enough to try." Margaret smiled, the same expression she'd worn on their first day of teaching when they'd faced a classroom full of 7-year-olds and decided to prove that learning could be an adventure. "I like that legacy," she said. 5 years later, the Torres Foundation had become one of the most respected charitable organizations in North America, with Elena Torres recognized internationally for her work in community rebuilding, and Harold and Margaret honored by the President of the United States for their contributions to social justice. But the real measure of their success wasn't found in awards or recognition. It was found in a letter Elena received from a young man in Colombia whose family had been destroyed by cartel violence when he was 8 years old. The Torres Foundation had funded the rebuilding of his community, provided him with educational opportunities, and helped his mother start a legitimate business. "Because of your foundation," he wrote, "I grew up believing that good people exist and that evil can be defeated. Today I became a police officer. Not because I want revenge against the criminals who destroyed my childhood, but because I want to protect other children from experiencing what I experienced. Your father's money didn't just rebuild my community, it rebuilt my faith in justice." Elena shared the letter with Harold and Margaret during one of their regular video calls. At 82 and 79 respectively, Harold and Margaret had stepped back from the Foundation's day-to-day operations, but they remained its spiritual guides and moral compass. "Your father would be so proud," Margaret told Elena. "Not just of the Foundation, but of the daughter who proved that his love was worth his sacrifice." Elena smiled, her father's gentle eyes bright with tears of joy rather than grief. "He would be proud of all of us. We proved that teachers really can change the world, one student, one community, one act of courage at a time." Harold and Margaret still lived in the mansion, now designated as the Torres Foundation headquarters and a historical landmark commemorating the power of redemption. They spent their days answering letters from foundation beneficiaries, reviewing grant applications, and welcoming visitors who came to see the place where hidden treasure had been transformed into visible hope. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the front terrace and watch the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors, remembering the night they'd first discovered Vincent Torres's secret and decided that some treasures are too important to keep. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Margaret said one evening, as they watched their neighbors' children playing in the community park that had been built with foundation funding. "I think about all our former students who heard this story on the news. What do you suppose they thought when they realized their old teachers had found buried treasure and given it all away?" Harold chuckled. "I think they probably weren't surprised. You spent 30 years teaching them that sharing was more important than keeping, that helping others was more valuable than helping yourself. Maybe this was just the final lesson." Margaret reached for his hand, fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of a love that had survived 47 years of marriage and the adventure of a lifetime. "Best lesson plan we ever created," she said. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, Harold and Margaret Brennan sat together in the mansion where they'd discovered that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Behind that door, they'd found more than money. They'd found purpose, meaning, and the chance to prove that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort, justice over security, love over fear. Vincent Torres had spent 6 years planning his own disappearance. Instead, Harold and Margaret had spent 5 years ensuring his reappearance, not as the man who'd committed crimes, but as the father who'd died seeking forgiveness, the guilt-ridden soul who'd transformed stolen wealth into community healing, the broken man whose legacy became wholeness for thousands of others. The desert had brought them here for a reason. They had found that reason buried beneath the floor of a mansion, hidden in the journals of a dead man, waiting in the tears of a daughter who'd never stopped loving the father she thought had abandoned her. Some treasures are measured in gold, others are measured in lives changed, communities healed, hope restored where despair had ruled. Harold and Margaret Brennan, 2 retired teachers who'd come to the desert looking for a place to die quietly, had instead found a place to live loudly, not with noise, but with the kind of purpose that echoes through generations. Anyone can find hidden treasure if they're brave enough to look beneath the surface and wise enough to know that the most valuable treasures are the ones you give away. As another perfect desert sunset painted the sky in shades of redemption, Harold and Margaret understood that their greatest discovery hadn't been Vincent Torres's hidden fortune. It had been the truth that some stories never end, they just find new voices to carry them forward, new hearts to give them meaning, new hands to transform them into hope. Their legacy would live on in every scholarship recipient who became a doctor, every rebuilt community that chose healing over hatred, every child who grew up believing that good people exist and that justice can triumph over greed. Vincent Torres had hidden his guilt in a basement. Harold and Margaret had transformed that guilt into grace that would shine for generations. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories that will restore your faith in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Click to keep discovering with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we choose to share.